Welcome to the Talking Right podcast, a bastion of conservatism in a wasteland of progressivism. Now here's your host, John Mosman.
Hello everyone, you're listening to the Talking Right podcast. I am your host, John Mosman. Thank you for listening. I appreciate your support out there. If you'd like to know more about how you can support this program and other stuff that I'm working on, you can go to my website at johnmosman.net. johnmosman.net. You can find blogs and links to my podcast and everything else that's nice at my website. You can also follow me on Twitter at JOLEMO376 and at Facebook, John Mosman Live. That is the page. You can go there to interact with some of the stuff I have and follow. I usually try to keep that posted quite regularly. Anyways, wanted to let you guys know that I kind of mentioned and promised something that I could do for y'all, and that was to have the new podcast. And if you want to know something, it kind of went a long ways into developing that for you. So I appreciate everybody coming out and listening. And I promised on my Facebook and on my Twitter accounts that I would have a nice little surprise for you. And that little surprise right there was that I was able to get a nice little voiceover there for the start of the show. I hope you guys like it. Tell me what you think about it. You can go to my Twitter account and tell me. And I'm working on a few other things to add to that. But anyways, I wanted to talk about what makes you conservative. I wanted to get back on track on talking about conservatism. You know, from time to time on this podcast, I will talk about, issues. This is my main podcast, and so I will talk about stuff like that. But, I think it's important that you get a sense of what it means to be conservative and to have someone talk about what it means to be conservative, because these things are just kind of left a lot. It's either, well, you're conservative or you're not. And if anything that we could have seen from the Republican primaries is we can see that there's a lot of different conservatives out there. The kind of a conservative Rick Santorum is a completely different kind of conservative that Ted Cruz is, or even Ben Carson. So there's kind of levels there of what it means to be conservative. For the longest time, conservatives are usually thought of as the people who are the Tea Party people, and a lot of that's because a lot of conservatives did kind of go with the Tea Party movement and tried to, go on the Sarah Palin Express, and I get it. I used to be on the Sarah Palin Express. I used to think that she was the best shot for conservatism in this country. I was also delusional. But part of it isn't our problem. It isn't a conservative problem. It was a political problem. It was a political party problem. It was a Republican problem. And that's because the Republicans don't really want conservatives in their party anymore. They want to be moderate. They want to be just like the Democrats. And I hate to tell it to you folks, you Fox News watching folks, but Fox News isn't conservative either. So I think it's important that you get a sense of what it means to be conservative, because I think a lot of people think that being conservative means being Republican, and it doesn't. A lot of people think being conservative means being pro-immigration or anti-immigration. It doesn't. Some people think it means being pro-military, like being okay with Iraq. I'm one of the conservatives who wasn't big on us going into Iraq. But I hope that we would have finished it, and I did applaud George W. Bush's understanding that in order to get the job done, you gotta be committed to it. But of course, now we're seeing what happens when a liberal gets into the White House and that commitment is not followed through. If anything, the stuff that we're seeing going on in Iraq, it's similar to the Vietnam War. where the problem isn't that there was a war. It wasn't the problem that our military couldn't do the job. America has had one of the most dominant, if not the most dominant military in the world since the 1950s. But here's the issue that I have to say, and the issue here is that it's the politicians who are not wanting to commit. A good example of that within recent, well, I say recent, I mean it's been going on now, well, it's been about 22 years since the whole Black Hawk Down situation happened in Mogadishu, in Somalia. And we lost lives. And by most accounts, that whole issue was a failure. And of course, if you watch the movie, it's a great movie, but the movie doesn't tell you, because obviously the movie was made in Hollywood, and the Hollywood liberals praised Bill Clinton as the second coming. But the reality was, Bill Clinton and his policies are a huge reason why we had the problems that we had. For one, he didn't want us to have a fully loaded missiles with the gunships going in. Secondly, he didn't tell the military that he was brokering a back deal with the certain warlords that they go in and get in Mogadishu. So, I mean, those are all things. But that's not the point of what I'm trying to say. The point of what I'm trying to say is that, the issue with that has been commitment. And commitment is a huge thing, right? I mean, there's a reason why conservatives usually like to defend institutions. It's because commitment means something to us. Commitment, whether it be in the institution of the military, commitment, whether it be in marriage, commitment, whether it be in the institution of like churches that people take oaths, and your word means something. But conservatives, it's not just what your word means. It also happens to being backing that up and proving it. A good conservative is all about the rule of law. It's all about due process. A conservative is all about making sure that if you're going to say something or do something, you back it up. I'm sad to tell you that your progressive friends and progressive America right now is kind of at this point at a fever pitch of saying, look, you know what? No, it doesn't matter that I prove something. All I have to do is accuse you. All I have to do is accuse you of being a racist without any merit, without even understanding definitions of what it means to be a racist. Okay? We have that way too often now in America. We have people who accuse people for whatever reason because it's now politically convenient to accuse people. Our own President of the United States is doing the same thing. He is making accusations towards people who don't support his regime and don't support his ideas. So, if we're going to talk about what it means to make you a conservative, what makes you being a conservative, we can start that off right at the bat. But in my previous podcast, I go and I explain that there are some values that are similar that have happened, because there has been some changes to conservatism. I'm sorry, your garden variety conservative in America today is more aligned with a liberal, classical liberalism, not neoliberalism, but classical. Some actually are neoliberals. We'll discuss the difference between those things in a later podcast. But the reality is that there are some values that continue within the conservative ideal and ideology. And one of them is about caring about social issues. It's about caring about morality. It's about caring about these things. It's about freedom as well, and understanding what true freedom means. For a progressive, freedom means freedom to do as you wish, do as you want. Or for a conservative, freedom means freedom from tyranny, freedom from an organization or a government that will oppose you of what you want to live. Freedom says it's understandable from a conservative to live these things, but also understanding that just because you have the right to do something doesn't mean you do it. So if you want to take a nice little litmus test, and you really want to kind of get an idea, well, we can talk about the different specifics, right, of being conservative. There's an authoritarian conservative. There's a social conservative, fiscal conservative. We'll go into all those things. But if you want to get to the nuts and bolts of the situation, if you want to get to the nitty-gritty of it, being conservative means having compassion for people, but also obtaining the social right. We're socially populist in the sense that we believe in a good that should happen to society. It's why conservatives fought and rallied against slavery in both the 18th and 19th centuries, both in England and in here. And it was a relatively conservative president, although I didn't agree with all of his values, and there are some things we can talk about when it comes to Abraham Lincoln. I do, like so many people, tend to have a love-hate relationship with Mr. Lincoln. But I will say that when you hear him debating Douglas, he is coming at it from a socially conservative idea that it's not right. It's interesting, if you go back to the time of Abraham Lincoln and right before the Civil War, our country was at a divide. And what was the big issue of the day? The big issue was the ownership of other human beings. And I think, and I've said this before I've even put it out on Twitter, that today pro-choice people remind me of the 18th and 19th century slave owners who have that same fervor for defending that, right? Planned Parenthood wants to defend that because it's a money stream. Certain women want to defend it because to them, it does mean a difference between what they get to choose or not. And that means something to them because, again, in the end, the choice sometimes, not all the times, but sometimes, does end up being a choice about making a choice that financially suits her as an individual rather than her family, both as a child to be and the father that could be as well. It's important to get these things understood when talking about what it means to make you a conservative. Because a lot of people are going to say they're conservative, but they're not. It's interesting because I will talk about these kinds of issues definitively, but I also like to break them down, right? Do a deconstruction on these terms. One of the things that I did was, I did that on what it means to be fundamentalist. In fact, I wrote a whole piece last year on my website, on my blog, about atheists who are fundamentalists, right? And how they're becoming just like the religious fundamentalists. There are sometimes people who are conservative who think they're conservative, but they're not. They may be politically conservative for our day and age, but when it comes to religion, they're not. I think, and I would defend this argument to my dying day, that to be conservative in one venue and not the other isn't being conservative at all. The question then becomes, well, what are they? Well, it's very possible to be conservative in many factions and yet not be conservative, right? We're seeing more and more every day that hybrid politicalism and hybrid ideology is becoming more and more prevalent. People can be more conservative on this and yet more liberal on this. But if you're going to call yourself a conservative, there are certain values that you have to have. And unfortunately, conservatives today, most conservatives, are trying to undermine some of those things. I'm going to tell you, I'll be honest with you, that I find it very hard to be conservative and someone calling themselves conservative and understanding that conservatism ultimately means defending traditions and defending some of the institutions like family and marriage, that you would defend marriage in one vein and yet you don't defend it when it comes to being okay with people having to work 100-hour work weeks because they have to be able to support their family. And I think there's an inconsistency there. Just as I think there's an inconsistency when it comes to pro-life and being for the death penalty. And we can get to that topic, and we will. I promise we'll get to that topic about death penalty, because that one may take an hour, more than my usual 30 minutes I usually take. But But I believe that even though I understand why people can justify it, I can see why they do. I'm not completely not saying they don't have any points to it. I'm just saying those things have to be consistent. If you want to call yourself a somewhat liberal or conservative, if you want to call yourself a moderate, which I think more people need to call themselves moderates. In some ways, I find myself moderate, just because there's things that can't really be classified. But that's another topic. But I can tell you this, when it comes to being conservative and talking about conservative values, I can tell you that the ones that matter the most is where I have it at. And those are understanding the idea of freedom, of doing the socially right and just thing, and preserving values that transcend time, that just don't need to be gone away with. G.K. Chesterton said that, traditionalism in a way is to give democracy to the dead, is to equate what dead men have said in the past as still being important, and not just throwing it all away because it's not convenient for our politically correct world today. But we'll talk more about that. I want your opinion on some of these things. Go to my website. Don't forget, I'm working on another podcast that you can find at my Spreaker profile, Spreaker.com, user JOLEMO376, same as my Instagram account, same as my my Twitter account. But working on that. I'm also working on some more stuff for my website and on some of the blogs. And just because I have to go right now doesn't mean the conversation has to end. You can tell me anything you like. You can go ahead, and I will maybe eventually try to get a Talking Right podcast thing, but you can just go ahead for now and tweet at me, JOLEMO376, hashtag Talking Right, and we can talk about some of these issues more, and maybe if you have a great comment or a message that you leave, we'll talk about it here on the air. Anyways, I do have to go. It's been a supreme pleasure of mine to continue this and to have you guys listening to it. So, good day, and we'll talk to you later. This is John for Talking Right Podcast.